Overall, a very strong SmackDown on February 6th. Two excellent matches instead of the usual one. Angle vs Benoit was unique because it was a non-title match, yet the champion won clean in the middle with the Angle Slam. Benoit busted his eye open during the match, so it added drama. I'd give the match 4 1/4 stars. Angle did the teased handshake after when Haas and Benjamin then jumped Benoit. Benoit did another UFC-style promo before the match that may have been his strongest since coming to the company as far as getting people into his quest. At this point, if Angle Benoit doesn't get over as the modern Funk Briscoe or Flair Steamboat, it's not from a lack of quality matches or effort to sell them. Obviously, marketability-wise, this feud can't be put in the league with the latter two, but in the ring it can. I thought this match was a step forward as far at least attempting to portray it as a big deal, and why. In that they made the point that Benoit has more wins over Angle than vice versa, and pretty much built the idea that Benoit is going to end up with the belt someday, something that I don't think many fans believe. The drawback is that Benoit versus Angle, no matter how great the matches always are, doesn't pop the masses, which is very similar to what happened in the Van Dam versus Lynn ECW feud, when they were having the best matches in the country on television at the time, but ratings were going down for shows built around their long matches. Benjamin and Haas over Guerreros was a 4 stars match, largely due to Guerreros putting on an incredible performance carrying them. Eddie was his usual self, and it was Chavo's best WWE performance I've seen. They made Benjamin and Haas seem so much better than they really are at this point. Finish of the match saw Eddie have Benjamin pinned after a frog splash while Chavo laid out Heyman with a pescado. The ref wouldn't count the pin since Haas was the legal man. Haas then did a flying Oklahoma side roll. Well, he is originally from Oklahoma, to pin Guerrero. Place popped big even though heels won, as the fans were just happy to see a title change. Even though the Guerreros don't have the college wrestling background, both were brought up in that environment by Gory Guerrero, Eddie's father, Chavo's grandfather, who was a legendary shooter of his day, so they both have great ability to do the working amateur wrestling style, which made them the perfect opponents for carrying Haas and Benjamin. The pushed aspect of the show was Hogan and Rock. They ended up airing both Rock promos. First was really strong, to the point he blows away everyone in the company. One can argue Flair, but since he doesn't get to do promos, he can't be counted. The second one I thought hurt more than helped, because by the time the Hogan-Rock deal was over, my thought was that I had less interest in the match now than I did before it. Rock was trying to play Mr. Hollywood heel, but it ended up making wrestling look insignificant to him and came off like one of those Nash promos that never drew a dime. Hogan tried, but Rock left him in a hole that he couldn't fully dig out of. He looked like a guy who the clock was ticking on. Kendrick has personality, but ultimately at his size in WWE, no matter how good he is, the best he can wind up is like Noble, which has stalled. Mysterio Noble had a good opener. Nunzio threatened Rikishi after losing, saying his friends, getting the impression it was the Mafia, were going after Rikishi. After all the stuff going on in Japan, that hits too close. Matt Hardy is going after the Cruiserweight title after losing to Kidman. I think Matt would make a good champion to elevate that division right now. The plan is for Goldust to return a changed man after being electrocuted. He'll now have all sorts of psychological problems, including Tourette's syndrome. The deal is that Dustin on airplanes and in the dressing room has often pretended to have Tourette's syndrome as a joke. Lesson number 1 in wrestling: don't ever cut promos on an airplane that you don't want to cut on live television. Tori Wilson is back on the road because she did her Playboy pictorial a few weeks back. She's scheduled as the cover model on the May issue, which comes out the same week as WrestleMania, timed from both sides for maximum cross-promotion. This week's news on Tatu's song All the Things She Said. Russian songwriter Sergei Galoyan, 22, filed suit against Universal Records claiming he wrote the song in February 2000, at the time titled I Lost My Mind, and held an audition to find one of the women to form a group to sing it and other songs a few months earlier. The other woman in the group he knew ahead of time. Galoyan is listed in the credits as only having written the music for the song. Bradshaw is scheduled to be able to start training in a few weeks. His return to television will likely be some time after that. There is talk of reuniting him with Ron Simmons, who had retired, as the APA. Even though Kanyon is on the road with the SmackDown crew, he is continuing to work his OVW program. He didn't have to, and he makes no additional money doing so, but he wanted to work out his angle the way it should be. At this week's OVW tapings, they continued to Kanyon vs. Johnny Jeter program, with Kanyon offering $500. When they say it's like watching the 70s, these numbers are the pre-inflation gimmick numbers, to Jeter if he can last 5 minutes with him. Kanyon kept getting near falls and finally won with the Diamond Cutter, but it was announced it was at 5:02, so he had to give Jeter the money. ended up stuffing 5 bills in Jeter's mouth. Gaida had her first TV match, and Jazz had her first match since knee surgery. Fortunately for Gaida, it was a tag. With her teaming with Nikita, they've teased trouble between the two heel women the past few weeks, versus Jazz and Linda Miles. Whenever Nikita would go for a tag, Jackie would tie her shoe and primp and pose. Nikita ended up throwing Gaida into the ring. Gaida then attacked Nikita. This enables Jazz and Miles to do simultaneous roll-ups for the pin, and also kept Gaida from having to do any wrestling moves. They did a backstage segment saying they were going to have a bikini match with Nikita versus Gaida to settle things. Kanyon told Doug Basham and Damaja they need to worry about their own affairs and not the women. They teased an eventual Basham versus Damaja match for the OVW title. TV main was the long-awaited Damaja versus Nick Dinsmore OVW title match. Dinsmore had Damaja in the figure 4 when Kanyon came out. Dinsmore went after him. Basham threw a chair in the ring. Damaja got it, but Dinsmore blocked it, grabbed the chair and hit Damaja. The ref, distracted by Kanyon, turned around at that point and called for the DQ on Dinsmore. Rhino worked a dark match on the show. ABC World News Tonight on February 8 ran a feature on Nowinski. Nothing much to it, but as mentioned before, Nowinski's gimmick is one that can garner mainstream attention because the media will think it's cute, similar to Mike Rotunda many years ago as Michael Wallstreet in WCW and to a lesser extent Irwin R. Schuster in WWF. Gimmicks that garnered mainstream media attention but didn't mean crap to wrestling fans. They showed fans booing him as he cut promos on Raw. No analysis that the gimmick has been unsuccessful thus far for ratings or anything like that, as they portrayed it like he was a top heel in the promotion. Right now, with the exception of Hogan and Rock, probably the guys in wrestling with the best shot at mainstream media pub are Nowinski because he was a Harvard grad and people think it's weird someone who went to Harvard would want to be a pro wrestler. Tenacity when they start discovering him he'll be everywhere. And Goldberg when he returns. Stratus was kept off the house shows the past 2 weekends because they are trying to sell she was injured in the Raw attack by Jazz. It almost blew me away they did that because following up on injury angles isn't exactly the company's long suit, as noted by Keebler being fine last week. The February 15th show in Winnipeg will be headlined by Jericho as a hometown babyface, working SmackDown challenging Angle for the SmackDown belt. For whatever this is worth, and likely will be changed weekly for the next month, the current bookings for SmackDown shows in March have Benoit vs. Cena, Guerreros vs. Rikishi and Mysterio, Lesnar vs. Show and Heyman and Angle vs. Edge as the top matches. Fred Blassie, who turned 85 over the weekend, was in rough shape at the Raw X show. The original plans were for him to do a promo but they were scrapped. He celebrated his birthday doing a radio interview on the cable radio network for Jeff Walton, a 1970s wrestling promoter and publicist for the LaBelle promotion, and before that, in the 60s, the president of Blassie's fan club. On the show, Blassie was surprised by a call from his biggest career rival, John Tolos, who he feuded with in the early 70s in Southern California, until the Athletic Commission wouldn't renew Blassie's license when he turned 56, and on occasion Blassie, by this point a manager in WWF, would be brought back in the late 70s when both were ancient for matches at the Olympic after the commission stopped caring about how old wrestlers were. In what was easily the biggest angle in the history of Los Angeles local wrestling, Tolos threw the Dread Moncel powder, is there a such thing? That he got from Dr. Bernhard Schwartz, a real person, kind of the local Za or Ian of his time who the wrestlers introduced to Arnold Schwarzenegger, in Blassie's eyes, blinding him for life supposedly. Actually, he went on a tour of Japan, which was reported in a lengthy article in the old Los Angeles Herald-Examiner. Still, the article couldn't kill an incredible angle, where Blassie returned but was always kept in a straitjacket for fear of what he'd do to Tolos, leading to the August 27, 1971 match at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, which drew 25,817 fans and $142,000 at the time, the second largest gate in pro wrestling history. Rematches were so hot that they not only sold out the Olympic Auditorium, but were broadcast live at a few local movie theaters, where they also sold out. Later, after Tolos turned face, they ran this big story about how Tolos had paid Blassie a huge out-of-court settlement which supposedly proved to the fans he was sorry and had changed his way. The two cut old-style promos on each other. Blassie is the exception to the rule of the former wrestlers, and this may be because he's always had a job with WWE, because during the show, he told Tolos that the two of them were good wrestlers in their day, but that the guys of today are so superior to the guys of their era in every way. He didn't even bring up promos and psychology, which are the two facets the old-timers like to point to, because they are valid points, because athletically there is no comparison overall. We're nothing compared to these guys. he said. He said it several times during the interview. If his book is as honest as the interview, it may be a very good read. When asked about various rivals of Edward Carpentier, he said he was conceited and didn't have good things to say. About Lou Thesz, he said he was the all-time greatest wrestler ever and that for much of his, Blassie's, early career, he wasn't even qualified to be in the same ring as Thesz. The two both started out in St. Louis and started at about the same time as Blassie, is 2 years younger, although Blassie's career peaked later than Thesz. When asked about Mil Mascaras, he said that he didn't like him because Mascaras only wanted to do what would make Mascaras look good, and he was all for himself. When asked about Dick Bayer, he called him one of the 10 best wrestlers ever. When asked about Giant Baba, he said he was a big guy who couldn't make it in baseball, so they tried to turn him into a wrestler. When asked about Rikidozan, Blassie said he wasn't a great wrestler. When asked about Bruno Sammartino, Blassie said he wasn't that good at the holds, but he was the strongest guy he ever faced. When asked about Don Carson, the two had a big rivalry in Los Angeles around 1969, he said that Carson was an example of a guy in the right place at the right time, basically intimating that Blassie himself was so hot at that point anyone he worked a program with would have been a star. He said Carson got a big head after his success in Los Angeles, but noted that except for that period, Carson never did anything big in a major territory. I've been told that Keith Greenberg did a great job on Blassie's autobiography, which comes out in April. The latest on the Ric Flair book is that the deal where Vince McMahon buys the rights to the book from St. Martin's Press, which made a deal for the book before Flair had signed with WWE, to assign the book to Simon & Schuster, which has an exclusive on WWE Books, is expected to go down shortly, and the book would go into high gear at that point. Because of the costs of paying off the former publisher and the former writers, this is probably the most expensive book WWE will publish as far as upfront costs, so the pressure is on for it to be a good book. TV Guide had an article on soap opera star Rebecca Budig, noting her brief period as co-host for Sunday Night Heat when that show hit the ratings skids. The article called the show a freaky mix of wrestling and rock music airing live from Times Square and said she hated it a lot. Austin was at ESPN Studios on February 6 filming a commercial for SportsCenter where Dan Patrick hit him with a chair. The Japanese magazines last week were loaded with stuff on the WWE tour, focusing largely on Tajiri challenging Triple H for the title. Tajiri, who was up to this point not a big star in Japan, even got a magazine cover. Keibler was another huge favorite overseas. As it turned out, the February 1st Samurai TV Japanese 24-hour combat sports cable station special on the WWE Tour of Japan consisted only of interviews, including a Dudley's interview that went 10 minutes. No matches were shown. Confidential featured a few somewhat interesting pieces. They first ran a segment on Fred Blassie's 85th birthday, talking about his career in not very much detail at all. They acted as if he was one of the main stars of the early days of wrestling on television, which wasn't the case. They had a clip of one of what appeared to be an early 50s match. They talked little about his heyday in places like Atlanta and Los Angeles, or even his Japan exploits. I guess it'll be saved for the book. They did a segment on Bob Holly and Matt Cappotelli, appearing to build up the idea of a match when Holly is ready to return. Holly played heel and was saying that he didn't do anything wrong. They did have a clip of Snow from Tough Enough, which was strangely edited off the show, where he did say to the kids that Holly went too far, while Ivory just talked about it as just a part of wrestling. Big John Gaburek defended Holly, saying if it had gone too far it would have been stopped. Big has lost so much respect of so many people this season. They had some clips of Austin complaining about being fired and how he was fired from WCW, and Bischoff answering it, saying there was a situation where he no-showed a taping, and since he was always getting hurt, Bischoff said he got tired of it. Nobody ever mentioned that TV taping where he held up the entire taping by refusing to do a job for Renegade, which actually gained him a lot of respect among wrestlers at the time. The segment was preluded by Okerlund saying that by order of Vince, Bischoff had until the end of the show on Monday to sign Austin or be fired. I got a headache at that one. If Vince wanted Austin signed in Storyline, why did he not invite him to Raw? And Vince never in Storyline told Bischoff he had to sign Austin. They had a segment of Arnold Anderson reminiscing about childhood with his best friend from grade school who he played high school football with. Apparently Anderson was regularly in jail for fighting in Rome, Georgia, and felt he had to get out of town because of his rep, and luckily met wrestler Ted Allen and paid him $500 to train him and ended up on the road. They kind of portrayed Anderson as just a regular guy who somehow ended up as a big star. They also showed a plug for Lawler's book, filming him going to a media day in, where else, Memphis, where everyone knew him and treated him as royalty. There was a TV AM show appearance at WHBQ where Lawler talked about having wrestled in that studio for 25 years, apparently trying to make people think it was the WMC studio. Wrestling did air in the early 70s at WHBQ, but Lawler would have been part of it for about 6 years. They also showed him doing a local radio spot on a book signing, and showed some clips of him wrestling in the 70s in his Memphis glory days, some studio clips including the angle where he threw a fireball at Andy Kaufman. It's interesting that they tried to push that Lawler's biggest feuds ever in Memphis were with Hogan, Savage and Kaufman, as opposed to the people he really had his biggest drawing feuds with, like Bill Dundee, Jos LeDuc, Jimmy Valiant and Jackie Fargo. No doubt Kaufman was the most talked about because of the movie, Letterman and Comedy Central, and some national exposure in the mainstream media at the time, but even with that, it was never close to one of his biggest drawing programs. In a story in the San Diego Union Tribune as a preview to the weekend house show, Triple H hinted he would wrestle Steiner on the show, saying he would be there for his match. He also, when asked about the company's popularity decline, blamed it on the cyclical nature of the business. What do you expect him to say? Bad writing or booking? The Kendrick streaking segment, by the way, in real life, he was running around wearing a jock, was edited in Europe to remove all references to Nike. The deal in the US is what's known as product placement, in which sponsors pay a fee to the company to get their products mentioned during a broadcast as opposed to doing an actual commercial. That sort of thing is illegal under UK television regulations. That is a rule not closely enforced, because they didn't blur our cores when Austin drove the truck in, yet they did blur out he brand of APA's beer on Raw in the past some weeks, and not in others, so they aren't consistent at all with this, and they did nothing about the Coca-Cola product placement all over American Idol. It also should be noted that even though that commercial, which now has a second wrestling reference since Reebok has done a commercial with the Terry Tate character, former wrestler Rasta the Voodoo Man, spearing the hell out of a streaker as one-upmanship, has British announcers, it has never aired in the UK. The segment itself aired, but they did sound edits whenever Nike was talked about. WrestleMania, the major pay-per-view dates are Backlash on April 27 in Worcester, Massachusetts, Judgment Day on May 18 in Charlotte, Insurrection on June 7 in Newcastle, England, King of the Ring on June 15 in Houston, and Vengeance is July 27. SummerSlam is August 24. Unforgiven is September 21 in Philadelphia, No Mercy is October 19, Survivor Series is November 16, and Armageddon is December 14. They did learn from last weekend. At the shows this weekend, there were signs posted above the doors stating that Triple H would not be wrestling on the show due to an injury but would be at ringside for the main event. Also, as a cost-cutting measure, besides cutting down on the number of wrestlers being sent to the house shows, they aren't doing pyro at most of the house shows. O'Hare worked the Raw house shows this weekend even though he appeared to debut as a SmackDown character. February 7th in Houston for Raw drew 3,500 with a special localized main event of Triple H vs. Booker for the title being pushed. Houston is consistently, along with Memphis, the city WWE draws the highest ratings in, and ever since before WMX7, has been one of the best drawing cities in the country. It probably didn't help in Houston that Booker has never been taken care of as a homegrown superstar in booking, and that for most of his career, it was never even acknowledged he was from Houston, being billed from Harlem. February 8th Raw in Fresno drew 4,500. February 9th Raw in San Diego drew 5,000. February 9th SmackDown in Boise drew 3,000. February 10th Raw taping in Los Angeles drew 10,000. February 10th SmackDown house show in Davis, California drew 1,500. In Houston, with Triple H injured, they used Batista as a sub with Booker going over. Crowd didn't get into the match with many leaving during the bout. Flair worked the weekend house shows and was allowed to even talk, running down local fans with the same "shut up fat boy and I did your mother" lines he was probably using in the 70s. Flair also took some bumps toward the finish. Triple H also interfered on the weekend shows using his crutch. Best match was said to be Regal and Storm over Dudley's with the same finish they've been doing everywhere, ending with Morley going through the table post-match after Regal had used the power of the punch on Bubba. Steiner was already down to working the opener, a match with Christian which was mainly stalling. Fresno was mainly the same as Houston, except Booker and Steiner switched spots on the card. Booker worked the opener beating Christian. Steiner worked the main event over Batista in a match which saw interference from Booker and Flair. Storm and Regal over Dudley's due to help from Morley was the other big match. Largely the same show in San Diego except for the addition of a 3 stars half Mysterio over Eddie Guerrero match. It was scheduled as Rey vs. Chavo, but his wife was giving birth so Eddie took his place. After the match, a fan with a Sting mask and wig hit the ring and security took him out. In the process, his shoe came off, and Earl Hebner grabbed the shoe and threw it into the crowd. Flair and Triple H both got cheered wildly coming out. Steiner vs. Batista was a boring main event with Flair and Triple H both interfering until Mysterio chased both of them to the back, allowing Steiner to get the pin after a messed-up-looking powerbomb. The readers' pages. The Sheik. I grew up in Detroit watching big-time wrestling every week. The very first live event I went to was in 1971 when I was 6 years old at Cobo. I was in the fourth row and saw Bobo Brazil beat the Sheik. I didn't realize exactly what was happening then or even what heat was, but the memory of that night has stuck with me for 31 years. I never missed another TV show or live event at Cobo until the promotion folded. As a kid, you always wanted to see who he was going to carve up or if somebody would beat him. I look at where wrestling is now, and in those days, it seemed a lot more special. Even Harley Race's NWA champion would work the match before Sheik. I now know it was because he would cause riots and they were afraid to put anyone on after him. The one feud that was the hottest was when Abdullah the Butcher, after they teamed for a long time, finally turned face. He and Sheik had some of the bloodiest brawls I ever saw. They had a cage match one Saturday where even announcer Terry Sullivan and the color commentator, whose name I forget, were sliced to shreds before it was over. Blood was everywhere. All over the walls, the floor, and it was just a 5 or 10 minute match designed to get you to buy tickets for the arena show. When Sheik wrestled at Cobo, there were gates as barriers between ringside and the crowd. When he wasn't on the card, there was only a rope. That's just another thing to prove that nobody ever has, and nobody ever will have as much intense heat from the fans. Don Boyk. I was present for all 3 Sheik vs. Bruno Sammartino matches in Madison Square Garden. The third match was not stopped due to blood. It was a Texas death match. Sammartino had gotten a pen away from Sheik and pounded on his arm until Sheik submitted. The next month, Sheik went wild in a match with Haystacks Calhoun, including attacking him with a pocketbook taken from a fan. Sheik was DQ'd, and this incident was the one that caused his suspension. The New York State Athletic Commission was pretty strict in those days to begin with, even restricting fighting outside the ring. Sheik in those days was over the top. While Abdullah Farouk would always threaten on interviews that Sheik would throw fire at Sammartino, it never happened due to the Athletic Commission. Bruno and Sheik also wrestled in other cities. I went to the Boston Gardens for their second match there, where Farouk was handcuffed to Arnold Scotland. Boston was hit by a blizzard that day and the show had to be postponed until the next night. Even though the date was changed and public transportation hadn't been restored, they still sold out as Sheik won via count out, spurring their cage match the next month. Mike Omansky. I really enjoyed the piece on Sheik. I have to confess I didn't really know a lot about him past that he was Sabu's uncle. In reading the bio, you can really get a sense of the man. It was the same thing with the piece you wrote about Tim Woods. I had known he was a top amateur wrestler and everyone in the world knows the finger-biting story, but there was so much more. Even as a fairly young fan, I get a lot out of those pieces on the older guys. David Sanservier. Your piece on the late Ed Farhat was very good. My condolences to his family. It was my honor to see the Sheik wrestle several times in Los Angeles in the late 60s against Fred Blassie. I saw him in Honolulu when Ed Francis brought him in to wrestle Johnny Barnett, Sweet Daddy Siki, Bull Curry and Haystacks Calhoun, and it was always sold out. The Sheik could get everyone's blood going. At the Olympic, Sheik and Blassie in 7 minutes had the place rocking. He is the greatest villain and definitely could anger fans with just a minor gesture or pulling his pencil out, throwing a fireball or raking the eyes. In his later years in Hawaii, he'd work tag matches and still get the fans going even though his moving was limited. The Sheik was tough and private. For all of us lucky enough to see him work with Abdullah Farouk, they are a combination of grace, finesse and chaos. There is a certain sadness that many of us older fans were unable to properly thank the Sheik for what he brought to wrestling, but perhaps that's the way Sheik would have wanted it. Jim Brooks. I want to personally say I was privileged and honored to have had the opportunity to work alongside the Sheik as his manager on independent shows, and owe to the Sheik for bringing me into the world of pro wrestling. Not only was I a working colleague of the Sheik, but I was honored to have been brought into his inner circle, not only as a worker but also as a friend to him and his family. He truly cared for the people he loved. The fond memories and times we shared together will always be with me. He will always be remembered. Goodbye, my dear friend. I will miss you dearly and forever. Thank you for allowing me to be part of your life, and I am extremely proud to have been part of your legacy. Vedri Abdullah Farouk Jr. Kullah. Great job on the Sheik. The newspaper coverage in Detroit was indeed abysmal. He was really the guy who built Cobo Arena. Every 2 weeks he brought money into Detroit. Of course it's only wrestling, so what do you expect from the press? Odd that the New York Times gave him a better obit than the Detroit papers. Brian Bookandis. A friend took me to the Maryland Championship Wrestling show and unfortunately they announced the death of the Sheik. I was sad to hear this but thought it was very professional when they had a moment of silence and told the bell 10 times in his honor. I think it's a sad day for the wrestling business when Vince McMahon doesn't even mention the death of this great star from the past on his television show, or so many other great mat stars. He has the best and unfortunately the only national showcase left for the business. Of course, we also know this is how he has always chosen to look at wrestling. They could run tribute tapes of stars who pass away and talk about their careers. Thanks to The Observer, I read about Sabu and discovered ECW in 1994 and made 3.5-hour trips to Philadelphia about 15 times. ECW sparked my interest in tight, believable wrestling that I used to get to see in Baltimore during the heyday of Bruno Sammartino. I really miss that era of wrestling, where you could talk to the people sitting around you and learn so much about the inside, new guys coming in and what was happening. The last WWE show I saw was in Hershey last year and the people probably never even heard of Don Morocco, let alone Karl Gotch. I know I sound like an old man, but it's too bad that WWE is the only major organization left. I miss seeing all the different promotions and it was great years ago reading about all the guys you never saw and get excited when they would finally come to the WWF. Another thing that hurts is the angles don't last long enough to mean anything. You used to tune into TV and see things build for a long period of time. I just miss the sport aspect and don't like the sideshow we have now, but I'll be a fan and watch it until the day I die. James Smith Jr. Hogan. Every time I read your writing that no wrestling ovation was as big, long or loud as the one for Hogan's returns, I think back to my childhood. Okay, how we remember things that happened 25 years ago aren't necessarily accurate today. But there was a match at the Spectrum with a sellout crowd where Bruno Sammartino convincingly defeated Spiros Arion in a cage match, leaving him laying dead on the ropes, and very slowly, almost Buddy Rogers-like, strutted out the door of the cage. There was a standing ovation for at least 15 minutes. The noise was so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. Dave Katz. As a longtime reader of The Observer, it amazes me your biased view of Hulk Hogan. Is he a liar? Yes. Does he twist more stories than anyone? Yes. I'm certainly not going to defend his obvious character flaws or his own personal views about himself and the business that come pretty close to him thinking he is Jesus Christ after all, but the facts speak for themselves. He is the biggest name pro wrestler of all time. It's not even close. His matches with Andre the Giant and Rock are the two biggest matches of the last 25 years. He was the biggest draw, the best at working a crowd, and headlined more pay-per-view shows than anyone. He gets a great pop, but it means nothing for business. Reference you throw around may also be true, but who is drawing people or ratings today? Can you please give an unbiased and accurate portrayal of what Hogan has meant to this business over the last 20 years? Mike Sawyer. DM. Nobody has ever denied Hogan and Austin as the two biggest drawing cards in North America of the last 20 years. For peak impact, Austin was bigger because his attendance averages blew away anything Hogan ever had, but Hogan had more longevity, so you can make a good case for him being number one. Hogan is the biggest pay-per-view draw ever. I'm not sure he headlined more pay-per-view shows than anyone, but he did draw more. I think you can make a strong case for the Andre match as being one of the biggest of the past 20 years because it drew the best real buy rate, it was the biggest closed circuit match ever and holds the US attendance record. But I can't put the Rock match in that category. There is no way it can be ranked above Rock vs. Austin the year before, which drew considerably more money. WWE reference in law class. In my business law class, we were talking about intellectual property and trademarks. To illustrate her point, my teacher, who is a lawyer, asked if anyone knew of an example of somebody violating a trademark. Somebody brought up the World Wildlife Fund lawsuit against WWF. Both she and my teacher had absolutely no idea what the story really was. My teacher went on and on about how that wrestling group had to change its name because the World Wildlife Fund had the initials first. I raised my hand and she asked if I knew anything about the subject, and basically recited the info on the case you've written in The Observer over the past several months. She looked at me like I had two heads. I was just shocked that a lawyer who is teaching a class would talk so much about something she knew nothing about. I think it would be very interesting to see a study or an article on how society makes no attempt whatsoever to understand wrestling, but still treats it as a joke. Bill O'Reilly, for example, whom I respect and usually enjoy and even agree with his views, when he talked about the Lionel Tate case, he flat out blamed wrestling. Anytime you see a wrestler on a talk show or wrestling covered in the public spectrum, the host of the segment inevitably has a smirk on his face. Jim Lehman. DM. It's so different in Canada. W1. I just finished watching the second with one show with the horrible Abdullah vs. Masaaki Sadake match. It was just awful. Of the last 4 matches, I'd classify 3 of them as duds and the Goldberg and Muta vs. Chronic match as being half 1 star. This got me to thinking about some of the worst shows I've seen in the last 18 years. I remember some terrible WWF pay-per-views in the mid-90s, the UFO show from this past summer and some terrible WCW shows in 1993. But I couldn't come up with one show as bad as W1. Do any come to mind to you? Doug Blecker. DM The 1991 Great American Bash in Baltimore was worse than W1. W1 had as bad a series of headline matches, but it did have 2 great undercard matches. I've seen shows with no good matches, including some recent bad Wednesday nights. Heroes of Wrestling was probably the worst ever. This is the end of the issue. Wrestling fans, we will see you on down the road.